Fantastic. Well, that's my signal. Welcome, everyone. I'm Richard Kravitz, Director of the UC Center, Sacramento. Um, Today, we have something special for you. As you know, there's an election coming, and so we're interrupting our regular series of talks, which are usually on Wednesdays, to focus on politics. As you may know, our regular series this year focuses on economic recovery after COVID, the future of publicly funded education, and supporting California's future workforce. But today our featured talk is about politics and specifically the US Constitution, which seems especially timely given the many conversations we've all been having about the Electoral College, the Senate, the Supreme Court, specifically, and minoritarian rule generally. So to lead us through this set of issues, we're pleased to welcome Paul Pierson. Professor Pierson is the John Gross Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. He's the author of many books, including Off Center, The Republican Revolution, and The Erosion of American Democracy and Winner-Take-All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class. But his most recent book, just published, and co-authored with Jacob Hacker from Yale, is Let Them Eat Tweets, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. In this book, the Washington Post writes, Hacker and Pierson posit that the Republican Party, like elite-aligned parties and other times and places, faces a conservative dilemma, how to persuade ordinary citizens to vote for the party that represents the interests of society's richest and most powerful members. So this introduction could really go on and on. Professor Pierson has many awards and accolades, and of course, many more publications. But in the interest of hearing from him, rather than me, we'll get started soon. But first, a word about question and answer. Dr. Pierson will talk for roughly 40 minutes, after which there'll be a Q&A session. Please use the Zoom feature to virtually raise your hand and center staff will call on you. And one other note, next week, Thursday, October 22nd, for those politically minded among you, we have another politically focused talk. This one entitled How Election Reforms, Participation Trends, and COVID-19 Will Shape California's 2020 Election. And this will feature Assembly Member Mark Berman and Senator Tom Umberg. So we hope to see you there as well. You can get more information on our center website, uccs.ucdavis.edu. And so without further ado, Professor Paul Pierson.
All right, thank you, Richard. I'm going to see if I can get my slides up here so that people can see that part of it. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to try to really stick to the time limit because I want to make sure that we do have a chance to have some questions and answers, a little bit of discussion about this because the questions that I want to talk about today, which actually are only very loosely connected to the book that Richard gave such a nice introduction to. I think these are questions that a lot of Americans are thinking a lot about right now. So I definitely want to leave time to hear people's reactions and their questions. And I also just want to start by thanking everybody at the center there. I wish we could be doing this in person, but I really appreciate all the hard work that goes into setting up these talks and making these kinds of conversations possible. So the last 6 or 7 years at Berkeley, I've been teaching PS1, which is Introduction to American Politics, and really interesting class to teach, 200 to 300 students every semester, and a real mix, lots of folks born and raised in California, of course, but also people coming from very different places, including beyond the shores of the US, and who are puzzling to make sense of the American Constitution and the American political system. And of course, it's been super challenging this year, challenging to go to remote, but also, and in fact, actually, a lot of these students are taking their midterm as I speak. Today is the midterm day. But also challenging because of the extraordinary things that are going on in American politics. And we obviously can't talk about, we can only scratch the surface in the time that we have here today. But I want to focus on the American Constitution and how the American Constitution operates in the kind of political climate that has developed in the US over the last 30 or 40 years, and how well it works in that kind of context. And it's been striking. I've been teaching about American politics to undergraduates for a lot longer than 6 or 7 years. And something that's always struck me is that most students, certainly most American students, start with a kind of reverence for the Constitution and a premise that it's the best possible way to design democratic institutions. But at the same time, they're often highly critical of American politics. And so I've always been interested in how they juxtapose those two things. But I think I've noticed, I'm sure I've noticed over the last 3, 4, 5 years that reverence has diminished a little bit. It's definitely still there, but I think there is a lot more concern about core features of the institutional arrangement and the way that they perhaps contribute to, or at least don't seem to be able to handle important things and troubling things that are happening in our politics. So I want to just sketch out some of my own thinking about this. And a place to start, everybody likes to start with Hamilton these days, and political scientists always like to start with the Federalist Papers. This one is not one that gets as much attention, but in it, Hamilton says, in a slightly cocky way, the science of politics, like most other sciences, has received great improvement. The efficacy of various principles is now well understood, which were not known at all or imperfectly known to the ancients. Right? So we've got this, is basically the position that he's staking out here. And something that I emphasize to my students is that there was an enormous amount that the founders did not know and could not know, given when they were writing and how limited their experience there was in the world with any kind of arrangement like what it was that they were contemplating. To say this is not to say anything critical of the founders, of the framers. Of course, they also operated under political constraints. There are other challenges they faced, but the truth is they knew far less about how to make a democracy function than we know today. And so important features, I think, of the system they designed are features that a fledgling democracy today would be extremely unlikely to adopt. Right? So to say this again, it's not to criticize them, not to sneer in any way at what they were able to achieve, but just to look at things realistically and recognize that that they were operating under very tight constraints, under circumstances where very little was known about these kind of challenges. And of course, in a society that was radically different than the society that we live in, a society with 4 million, maybe 4 million inhabitants, overwhelmingly rural and agrarian society, quite different from ours. But around the same time that Hamilton was patting himself on the back here, something that the framers did focus a lot of attention on was fear of partisanship, fear of majority factions in particular, the danger of an overweening party that would take control of the political system. John Adams writes, a division of the Republic into 2 great parties is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil. Right? And of course, Adams shortly later is going to be president when exactly that kind of confrontation is starting to develop and really put even the early American constitutional arrangement on pretty precarious footing. Madison writes, should a state of parties arise founded on geographical boundaries and other physical and permanent distinctions which happen to coincide with geographical boundaries, what is to control these great repulsive masses from awful shocks against each other? Right, so they're describing political polarization, partisan polarization, and especially between 2 parties as possibly the greatest risk that a democracy can face. They probably worried about tyranny even more than they worried about this, but this was way up on their list. And yet, this is the situation that we confront today. And so I want to talk just a little bit about how that's happened, in spite of the founders' hope that they could avoid this kind of outcome, and then talk more about how the development of this intense partisan polarization has affected the way our Constitution operates and generated, I think, some pretty serious challenges for our political system. All right, so just a few really quick points about the constitutional design. And I'm highlighting here features that I think are particularly relevant to the political environment and the functioning of the institutions that we're experiencing today. All right, so following some of Madison's ideas, or at least Madison's ideas as he had to revise them, having lost some important battles in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, we have a separation of powers system. It's not a parliamentary system, right? With many veto points built into it. The House, the Senate, the presidency, the courts, all organized along different lines, and all of them potentially capable of blocking the others. We have winner-take-all elections from single-member districts, districts that are based on geography. So there's no proportional representation in this system. Of course, many democracies today have proportional representation, but coming in second in American politics doesn't get you anything in electoral terms, right? You either get the seat or you get nothing. And political scientists now understand that a system like this, especially when it's combined with the presidency as a big prize, that competitors are going to want to join together and form unified teams, and in the hope that they're going to be able to gain the presidency. Very quickly, this is going to produce a two-party system, which it did in the US. It took less than a decade before you had a fierce and robust two-party system. The second thing, and I emphasize this because I'm going to come back to it later, this way of choosing our representatives intensifies cleavages between urban and rural areas. Right? It accentuates divides based on geography, and I'm going to show later, it produces a pretty pronounced rural bias into the political system. And that's reinforced by something that comes out of the convention in Philadelphia over Madison's objections, which is robust representation for small states in the Senate, right? Every state gets an equal voice in the Senate, even though some states are much, much larger than others. And of course, this distinctive feature of the Senate, the way in which it apportions seats based on territory rather than based on population, I think is a profoundly important feature of the contemporary American political setting. So I said that we had a two-party system, but for much of American political history, political scientists have said, well, yes and no. There are two parties typically. Third parties find it really hard to gain a foothold for the reasons that I just outlined. But because the political system is so fragmented, right? And this was something that Madison argued in Federalist number 10 in particular, where people are representing very different geographic areas of the country. They're selected in different ways, depending on whether you're in the House or the Senate or the presidency. In the phrase of Tip O'Neill, Democratic Speaker of the House from Massachusetts in the 1980s, he famously said, all politics is local, right? Because people are chosen from these particular geographic areas, and so they're going to represent the interests that are important in that area. Nelson Polsby, a longtime faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley, described our system as not being a two-party system, but being a 100-party system. The Democratic Party in Mississippi was a very different Democratic Party than the Democratic Party in Massachusetts. And the Republican Party in California was very different than the Republican Party in Illinois. So what you got for much of American political history was, yes, two teams that waved their banners for presidential elections and other national elections. But the parties were relatively weak and very pluralistic, right? They involved lots of different factions. Most famously, if one thinks about the New Deal coalition of the Democrats from the 1930s through the 1960s and early 1970s, that included the governing elite from the most conservative part of the country and a lot of union working class support and liberal elements in the northern parts of the country. But they were a part of the same party for sort of strange, accidental, historical reasons that led them into a coalition. So that's why somebody like the great comedian Will Rogers could say, I'm a member of no organized political party. I'm a Democrat. And that made a lot of sense at the time that Rogers was talking about it. So we had a 100-party system, but no more. No more. This is a slide that has launched, I don't know, several hundred PhD dissertations in political science. It's an attempt using roll call votes in Congress to measure polarization in both the House and the Senate. Essentially, the divide and distance between Republicans and Democrats in the legislature. And you can see that it's high, that our politics was polarized between the parties in the late 19th and early 20th century. But then it drops down in the mid-century. In part, this is another way of seeing what I was just describing about the New Deal coalition. The Democratic New Deal coalition included a lot of very conservative politicians from the South in particular, who often voted with Republicans on issues. So during that period, you see shifting coalitions around different issues. There were liberals in both parties, there were conservatives in both parties. But that begins to change. You can see it's starting to change in the 1960s in the Senate and in both chambers in the 70s, but then with increasing rapidity after the early 1980s. And now there's essentially no overlap between the parties in Congress. The most conservative Democrat is still to the left on roll call votes of the most liberal Republican. And that's true in the House, it's true in the Senate. So, and of course it's true in our politics more broadly. What happened? Well, I spent a big chunk of the class in PS1 trying to explain what happened. And a lot of that is packed into this one slide that I have to move through very quickly. But here I'm trying to summarize a story that I think most political scientists would agree with almost all elements of this, though there's one piece of it that I'll talk about that I'm doing some research on now with one of my colleagues that maybe there wouldn't be universal consensus on, but I think it's not a really radical claim either. All right, so two big things happen in the 1960s. One is the civil rights movement and the decision of national Democrats facing increasing pressure from the civil rights movement to declare in favor of civil rights for African Americans, which of course famously happens in 1964 and 1965 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And this produces what is known now as racial realignment, in which it becomes clear for the first time which party is the liberal party on racial issues and which party is the conservative party on racial issues. And so people now can distinguish the parties more clearly, and they begin to sort into the party that makes the most sense for them. The second big change around the same time, slightly later, late 60s, early 70s, is a big wave in expansion of the role of Washington and the role of the national government in people's lives. And that includes everything from introducing Medicare and Medicaid and expanding Social Security to the development of the EPA, the Clean Air Act, major environmental consumer protection worker protection policies, all coming out of Washington. And also important developments like the Supreme Court's decision in 1973, Roe v. Wade, which declares that because the right to get an abortion is a constitutional right, that policy is going to be the same, at least the broad contours of policies are going to be the same, whether you're in Mississippi or Massachusetts, right? So that becomes a national issue being determined by the Supreme Court, and it becomes a partisan issue over time as the two parties pick sides, right? And people sort into the party that seems to fit them better, conservatives going to the Republican side, liberals going to the Democratic side, and over time developing more of an identity that goes along with that. Now, I think increasingly a tribal identity in which, because people feel that they're part of this team, right, or this tribe, they come to adopt a lot of the positions that party holds, and they're more hostile to the positions that are being offered on the other side. So the next point is the point that I think that I'm exploring in some work with Eric Schickler, which is it's not just the national government that changes. What we call meso-institutions, which are all the things, the social things that organize things in society that connect ordinary citizens to government, change as well. Media, political media becomes nationalized, and it also becomes intensely partisan, somewhat different ways on the left than on the right. We could talk about that if we had more time, but much more partisan media where people are getting their information from different sources, from national sources that are quite differently related to the two political parties. The same thing happens with interest groups. Interest groups see that more is going on in Washington and that the parties are pulling apart. And so they mobilize to become active in Washington, and increasingly they pick a side. Right? So if you care about abortion issues, whichever side you're on, say you're an interest group that's mobilized around those issues, pretty quickly you're going to figure out, as we move into the 1980s and 90s, that the key decisions are going to be made in Washington. They're going to be made by the Supreme Court. And the two parties are choosing very different people for the Supreme Court. So if you want to influence what's going on with abortion, by far the most important terrain is influencing which party wins. Right? So everything becomes nationalized. And as that happens, state parties begin to change too. They lose their autonomy and distinctiveness. Of course, the Republican Party in Massachusetts is still different from the Republican Party in Mississippi, but they're not nearly as different as they were 40 or 50 years ago. They're brought into the same orbit. They're influenced by these changes in media as well. They're influenced by the way in which national interest groups are becoming more powerful and playing a more important role in deciding who gets to run for office, even whether you're in California or Colorado or someplace else. So politics is becoming national and it becomes more tribal. That's the big change. And just one quick illustration of this. This is money from the National Rifle Association and how it's evolved since 1992. If you went to 1992, you would see strikingly that 40% of the money that the NRA donated to congressional candidates went to Democrats. Now, partly there were more conservative Democrats there, but it was also a world in which the NRA felt like it was important, if you were going to try to get anything done, it was important to have friends in both parties. Right? Now we move to a world where they are fighting for their side to win. And you can see by 2016, they're not giving money to Democrats. And interestingly, if you look at this slide, there are basically two waves. There's a kind of Gingrich revolution wave, right, where this starts to happen, mobilization, more intense partisan mobilization on these kinds of issues. This happens between 1992 and 1996. And then the second wave is another intensification of American politics that comes with the Tea Party in 2010, right? But more and more powerful interests in American society are picking sides, right? They're trying to support one party push it to the hilt, and that's true at the national level. It doesn't vary that much depending on what state you're in. So this is a very different world than the world that our constitutional institutions have worked with for most of their history. And I want to spend just a little bit of time now talking about the consequences. And I'm going to have to speed up if I'm going to be done in 15 minutes. So three things to think about here. The first thing I'm going to talk about is actually the second thing on this list, which is American constitutions create high barriers to policy change, right? Lots of veto points, right? You need a lot of consensus to get things done. Well, in the old system, before you had all this polarization, what that produced was a lot of bipartisanship, right? Shifting coalitions, often big majorities. If you go back to that legislation that I was describing in the late 1960s and 1970s, most of it was bipartisan. Most of the big changes that were introduced passed by big margins. Even though the government was divided, we had a Republican, Richard Nixon, and then Gerald Ford in the White House for much of that period. But you were able to form big bipartisan agreements. That was the only way you were going to get big policy changes, but it was possible. The separation of power system worked in such a way, as Madison famously put it, with ambition countering ambition. Right? So people involved in the government at Washington, they defended their parties, but they also defended their institutions. Right? So if you were a member of Congress, you wanted to defend Congress against presidential aggrandizement or against the courts. If you remember the House, you probably wanted to defend the House against the Senate as well. You defended parties and institutions. And then finally, there were representational biases that came out of the way territorial representation works in the US, the way it overrepresents rural areas. But those representational biases didn't produce any kind of partisan bias, because there were small states that were Democratic states and there were small states that were Republican states. That's still true to some degree. Rhode Island is a Democratic state, but it's much less true than it used to be, because party now lines up much more with the rural-urban cleavage in American society, which means if there are representational biases, that's likely to produce biases in representation between the two major parties. All right, I'm going to just say a little bit about each of these points. Now, with high levels of polarization, we get gridlock. The system was designed to require compromise, but it used to also facilitate compromise, right? Because the parties were such weak vessels with so many different factions in them, you could cobble together majority factions from elements in both parties. Now you can't do that. The parties are further apart. The base of your party doesn't want you to compromise with the other side. And parties have also found that when the other party is in a majority position, it is absolutely in your interest to make their lives living hell if you can, to just make it as impossible to do things as possible, because that will make voters grumpy and they're likely to blame the majority. So if you can obstruct, you should obstruct. Because of this, Congress has become increasingly gridlocked, and power has gravitated away from Congress to the president, to the courts, to state governments in some cases, right, who have to worry less about the federal government, or at least Congress telling them that they can't do something, and sometimes to private actors like big corporations who may not face the kind of regulation that they would face and kind of oversight that they would face if Congress were capable of legislating, which it mostly is not right now. The filibuster hasn't helped, right? There's been a rise in the use of the filibuster in the United States, which makes it even easier to lock Congress down and make it impossible for Congress to legislate. Presidents also become less constrained in this constitutional arrangement. Madison counted on the idea that ambition would check ambition, right? That Congress would check the president, the courts would check the president. But when polarization is high, party allies of the president may not check the president. They may cede congressional power to the president. They may allow the president to engage in behaviors, including anti-democratic behaviors that would have immediately generated a reaction decades earlier. And they may engage in behavior designed to advance the political power of their team, for example, through getting as many partisan supporters on the nation's courts as possible. I'm moving faster than I'd like to, but I do want to be able to get to Q&A. Just a quick example of this. In the 1970s, when Richard Nixon tried to take away some of the budgetary authority of Congress by asserting that he could decide to impound funds that had been allocated by Congress rather than spending them if he didn't like what was being spent upon, Congress responded immediately. The Senate voted 80-0. Right? Every Republican vote in the Senate that was cast went against the president. Right? As Congress rose up to protect its ambitions against the president's ambitions, to protect the power of the purse, which is maybe Congress's greatest asset. Now, when President Trump declared an emergency and used it to redirect funds that Congress had authorized towards funding his border wall, Congress did actually respond more energetically than it has to most of the things that President Trump has done. 11 Republicans voted in favor of challenging what the president was doing, but that they knew that that was nowhere near enough to override a veto from President Trump. And the overwhelming majority of Republicans wouldn't even vote for this, right? They didn't want to challenge the leader of their own party, even though he was acting in ways that significantly diminished the power of Congress. All right, lastly, I want to talk about how this has affected representation. All right, what is this slide that I'm showing you? Well, this is the path of the recent solar eclipse over the United States, mapped onto so these are the counties that the eclipse passed, and it's colored by who carried that county in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Right, so almost all of the territory that is being covered here falls into counties that were carried by Donald Trump, even though, as you'll recall, Hillary Clinton won something like 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did, right? So this is not, if you tried to measure population, this would look very different. But the point here is most of the territory, a lot of it with very few people in it, has a Republican majority in it. That really matters in contemporary American politics because the parties are now divided along an urban-rural divide. Our institutions systematically favor rural voters. And so it does raise the prospect, not just as Madison once wrote about it, of minorities being able to slow or block majorities, but of minorities being able to rule. So not just counter-majoritarian governance, but what might be called, it's an ugly term, but minoritarian governance, right? Where a party that is organized around more rural lines does not need to get a majority to consistently hold seats of substantial power in the American political system. And of course, the bias has become more pronounced over time as the US has become a more urban country. Anybody in California recognizes the way in which this disadvantages California national politics in the Senate in particular, where now you can potentially get a majority with only 17% of the US population. Back in 1800, it took about 30% because the disparities in the size of the states were a lot smaller than they are now. Now, of course, this matters because these states that are overrepresented now have political orientations that are much, much different than, say, the average median voter in the country as a whole. You can see this is comparing what various variables look like in the median Senate seat, right? The one that is right in the middle in terms of its distribution of the entire US population, compared with, say, the overall vote, right? So Trump lost a popular vote to Clinton nationwide by about 2%. But if you went to that median Senate seat, you would find that he had won that seat by 19%. He'd carried that state by 19%. That is a huge imbalance. And of course, another big difference is that these states are much wider than the population as a whole. They're much more opposed to gun control, right? So this is a question that asks people, what's more important to you, controlling gun ownership or protecting gun rights? And framed that way, the country is pretty divided, about equally divided on that, if you frame the question that way. But there's just a huge disparity between rural and urban areas. And of course, the rural areas are heavily overrepresented. So even a very mild and popular gun control bill like the one that was passed following the horrific shooting in Newton, that was tried to pass through the horrific shooting in Connecticut, school shooting, was filibustered. You couldn't, even though it was overwhelmingly popular in the country as a whole, the proposed legislation, you couldn't get it through Congress. So there's a huge rural bias that now really matters in our politics in the Senate. There's also a bias in the House. Maybe in Q&A, if people are interested, I could explain this more. But the fact that the Republican Party is organized on a more dispersed basis actually advantages them in the House. So that Democrats actually have to win the national vote in the House of Representatives now by something like 4 or 5 or 6% in order to actually have a majority of the seats. So even that branch, because so many Democratic votes are wasted in big cities where they rack up majorities of 80% or 90%. I'm in Barbara Lee's district. I believe that there's a Republican challenger, but it's going to be 85, 90% for Barbara Lee. But all those votes in our system, all those additional votes are wasted. They're not well distributed for maximizing your share of the seats. The Republicans' supporters are much better distributed in order to come out with more seats. And so you end up with even the House being skewed in the Republican direction, though not nearly as much as the Senate. And now, of course, the courts, in part because Republican presidents have gotten lucky about when seats have become vacant, in part because Republicans have twice won the presidency while not winning the popular vote because of the Electoral College. And in part because the Senate has facilitated the seating of Republican justices, that's happening right now, while blocking the seating of a Democratic justice. We have this extraordinary world where you would think that control of the Supreme Court would be largely dependent on who was winning presidential elections. But Democrats have won 6 of the last 7 presidential elections. If they win the popular vote, and that's the popular vote, if they win the popular vote this time, which is highly likely, they'll have won it 7 times in the last 8 elections, which has never happened in American political history. And yet the Supreme Court will have 6 of the 9 justices having been nominated by Republican presidents. So again, this raises the prospect, especially given how powerful the courts are in contemporary American politics, it raises the prospects of not just a kind of a counter-majoritarian veto protecting minorities, but of durable rule of a coherent minority. And a minority that will be well-placed, can't predict the future, what their decisions will be, but will be positioned, if they choose to do so, to overturn many laws that were popularly passed and Supreme Court decisions, prior Supreme Court decisions, which are highly popular. Right? So this is a really stunning development in American politics. We moved towards a very different system because our long-standing political institutions operate very differently under a setting where there is a two-party system. The parties are nationalized, highly polarized, and organized around this urban-rural divide, which advantages the party that draws its strength from rural areas. I in class like to show, if you've been on the Berkeley campus, you know the Campanile is the great landmark, and at the bottom of that wonderful structure, there's actually a bust of Abraham Lincoln. And so I asked my students, well, why is that bust of Abraham Lincoln there? And most people think, of course, that it has something to do with him being the great emancipator. But by the way, this picture is not the bust that I'm describing now. But the bust is actually there because Lincoln signed the Moral Land Grant Act during the Civil War, which set aside land to create universities, including the University of California. So it took federal land and said, if you develop a university on this land, you can have this land for free. A remarkable accomplishment, I think, of government to build the UC system this way, and so much else, and a testament to what could happen when you had a government that could function even at times of civil war. I imagine, based on what I've said, that many of the founders, as well as someone like President Lincoln, would be extremely alarmed at what happens when you put together our institutional arrangements with the kind of polarized politics that we have today. And I will leave it at that. And I think I stayed pretty close to my deadline. And I will open it up for Q&A.
That's great. So raise your hands in using the Zoom virtual tools, and center staff will call on you.